Hello, this is Mr. Chan. I am an IB graduate from a top school, which is ranked number 2 internationally by IB average score. I have been able to read the samples by my peers, and I can tell you what makes a piece of writing higher or lower level 7. I was an offer holder for Cambridge University as an international applicant, and I ended up with 45 points in IB. As an IB English tutor, I often feel frustrated. My students write well and have a strong command of English. However, even after 2 years of schooling, their practice paper 2 essays, which I expect to be perfect, are poor examplers. If the examplers they use as templates are weak, the chance of getting a 7 in an unfamiliar question is even more remote. Students watch countless videos of tips, so many analyses, and yet they still write very chaotic essays. So, what's the problem? Firstly, students fail to get their hands on perfect IB paper 2 essays that are specific to their 2 texts, which they have 2 years to prepare. For the 2 years, I expect you to have read the 2 texts and compared their similarities and differences, and also memorized the relevant quotations and analysis, so that when you go into the exam, you already have your perfect practice essays that you can morph onto the question. Similar to that, the second reason is students have unrealistic expectations with the sample essays out there. If you go out to read the sample essays on Google or elsewhere, you'll find that the essays are very good at answering the question. But in the exam, this is not very plausible because you only can remember so many quotations and analysis when you walk into the exam room. It is likely that you have to morph your perfect practice essays so that even when the question is different, you will still get a 7. Thirdly, while appreciating literature and becoming more cultured is important and maybe your objective for studying literature in the first place, the exam is not the place for that. The stakes are too high. Instead, we should help students to craft the perfect practice essays, teach them how to adapt these to the exam questions. In this video, I will convince you that the IB Paper 2 is a highly preparable exam. You only need to study and internalize well-crafted essays based on your 2 texts. Learn to adapt them to the examination question. This video is not for those of you who want to become more cultured. It is strictly exam-oriented. Our sample question is, how and to what effect are strangers or strangeness represented in the 2 works you have studied? I will not go into. There are 2 approaches generally. The first approach is you have 3 discrete examples of strangeness from each of your texts. You can still do pretty well with this approach. It is easier to write because you can choose a stylistic device to talk about that is common for your both texts, and then you compare them. However, the problem with this approach, or the limitation, is that it is not easy to construct a line of argument. Your thesis is just on the fact that you have different examples of strangeness in your essay. You might categorize strangeness in different ways, but it is harder to develop your essay. If you think about it, the best essays are the one in which it is so well connected that changing the order of one paragraph would destroy your essay. If you use 3 discrete examples, then it is harder to create the sense of development, and therefore it does not obey this rule. Therefore, I usually recommend stronger students to pick the approach which is on the development of strangeness or strange characters from 3 parts of your text, and often this involves using the end to illustrate the message, hence the purpose from the author. In fact, there's a literary device known as poetic justice, which is the fact of experiencing a deserved retribution for one's action, and therefore the end is often how the author illustrates the message. Very simply, the structure here is quite formulaic for crafting such an essay. You can see the structure is alternating, starting with an introduction, and then A1, which is for the text 1.1, B1, text 2.1, before going back to the first text, the second text, the first text, and the second text, drawing all the similarities and differences across them, before arriving at a conclusion. I would anticipate the comment section might be flooded with criticism. During my formative years, I've often heard of teachers criticizing students for writing essay based on a regimented template. They argue that students' creativity would be stifled if they are not free to experiment in however style they prefer. And to this, I have 2 counter-arguments. Firstly, I've poured my heart and soul during IB along with my peers as we battle for this paper 2 exam because I know that languages is where the students have the least control over the examiner's impression. I've shown my writing to many different tutors and examiners, and this is a structure that's been repeatedly tested to work. If I only have so much time in an exam, and I would bet on writing this approach, which by the time in the exam, I had become so familiar that I'm able to replicate it on the spot. While this approach may be formulaic, the end result is a thoughtful and fluent essay, so you want to stay with me. Now ideally, A1 and B1 should discuss similar literary devices, but this is not necessary because your text might be very different. And The opportunities to tie back the question would be the start of A1 and the end of B1, the start of A2, end of B2. So this way you wrap the entire essay and answer the question. So this is good practice to always take the quotation from the end of the book to illustrate again the purpose, context, and the fate of characters in A3 and B3. Take a second to read this and we'll analyze it. Begin with a hook and tie it to the question to what you want to talk about. Now, you are a sales. Your job is to persuade the examiner that you're writing an original essay, but actually you have practiced so much that you can borrow materials from your practice essays and apply it onto this question. So the first step is to manipulate the examiner with a hook. Neatly summarize the context and purpose of the novel or your text in one sentence. It is important that they are balanced. These two sentences are more or less reused in most of the paper 2 essays written about these two books. And with a thesis statement. So in the paper 2 essay, the devices are the evidence that you use to answer the question to score the points of criterion B, which is on how the choices of language, techniques, and style shape meaning. So here the purpose of strangeness is to challenge the contemporary norms. The student has interpreted strangeness in light of social context. Something is considered strange because it is surprising in the contemporary era. Now that is the line of argument. Take a second to digest this. Taken from the exposition of the text, this student argues that the text is strange because it subverts social norm. The subversion of social norm is an idea that keeps on getting recycled in paper 2. So this is just morphing the idea of social commentary on the strangeness. The format is straightforward. Always start by briefly contextualizing your quotation and then incorporate it in a flow style. So instead of Bronte wrote, you want to incorporate it into a sentence. Mrs. Reed punishes Jane for a tendency to deceit through solitary confinement. This is a paraphrase of the plot. And embed the quotation, a dreary sense of consecration. After that, immediately follow it up with analysis, reference to the author by the last name that conveys that this Jane perceives herself as a stranger in this place, which is a perspective that has been shaped by her childhood fear of Uncle Reed's. Name drop the device that you're analyzing and then expand your analysis with various keywords. You can see that the strangeness here is explored with a quotation and the symbol of a red room. So when you're preparing for paper 2, you should specifically obtain 2 quotations for each point, so you can develop your ideas and not end too prematurely with a very short paragraph. Now the concluding sentence is a powerful one. The symbol of the red room, a literary device where the student has memorized for the exam, is now transformed into a point of strangeness. It is strange because Jane challenged Mrs. Reed's authority, and this is an extra-textual reference. In the Victorian era, there's a saying where children were seen and not heard. The use of materials outside of the text is very important because it showcases your contextual knowledge. Now on to B1, which is the first point of the second text. The first sentence of B1 is to draw the comparison across A1 and B1, which I have bolded. Now the student is commenting on symbolism again of the second text, but that is not necessary. It does require very careful planning during your practice. I want you to note a number of features here. You can see that the synonym of the keyword of the question is built into the essay in various forms. For example, in a strange setting of Cimetière des Innocents, Granouille's mother attempted infanticide. The language here is highly analytical. Her demeanor towards Granouille in the dehumanizing reference. So when preparing the essay, you should already have collected phrase banks for the analysis of the quotation. So you're merely recalling them in the exam, and you're not coming up with new ways of writing this. Note the use of square brackets, which exposed his mother for infanticide. So these are often helpful during the exam when you need to add justification for the quotation to help the reader to digest your writing. There is a brief comparison here, wherever possible, and this is done at least once for every paragraph of the second text. The language is again very analytical. The strange survival instinct is further concretized in the symbol of Granouille as a tick. And this links one device to another. Grotesque antihero is an example of keywords that you need to collect during your practice. There are many quotations embedded in flow style, intertwined with analysis. Highly analytical language. By juxtaposing Granouille with these men, he recontextualizes the historical narrative onto his own work. And this is a statement that the student has borrowed from the papers written on these two books. So you should read the analysis not just from websites or IB online help, but you should read from Google Scholar, from journals online. Through the use of symbols, strangeness is depicted in the characterization of both protagonists. Note that the concluding sentence summarizes for both texts because it is at the end of B1. So for both protagonists, as outsiders of society, who then begin to challenge the dominant ideologies of their time. This helps the reader to digest the writing, and then it transitions from A1 and B1 to A2 and B2, which is when the protagonists have grown up and they begin to cause some disturbance. So there's a sense of development in your essay, and this is the reason that we put A2 and B2 after A1 and B1. There's a sense of structure. Moving on, A2 begins again with a sentence to develop the idea of strangeness of both texts before a topic sentence for Jane Eyre. Here, the student has picked the example of foil character, who is Jane's rival for Rochester's affection. Sometimes students pick very micro devices. Instead, for the paper 2, unlike paper 1, you should pick more macro devices. So those are character development, plot twists, contrast, foil characters. And they also come as a very good package because you can automatically slip in a few quotations to illustrate the change. First is the quotation on this foil character analysis, and then the significance of this is when Rochester marries Jane instead, and that subverts the Victorian expectations that they could not have married because of their class differences. This is strange, and what is the significance of this strangeness? Which is that it creates tension in the novel, which Bronte then foreshadows. Now I then sneak in another literary device, talk about the Gothic imagery of the splitting of the tree. So there's a wealth of vocabulary which have been highlighted in yellow: foil characters, aristocratic background, public approbation. You do not again come up with this during the exam. You collected them during the course of studies. Some very good writers have written sample essays for you, and you directly take it from them, so you don't risk misusing these words. Finishing A2, now on to B2. Take a second to read this yourself again. Now, through the use of Granville's foil character, Susskind critiques another strange phenomenon. During this, okay, now we're talking about the context. Scientific irrationalism. B2 is a well-written paragraph because it demonstrates context and purpose together. Here, the student talks about foil character for the second text, but this time he brings out the discussion on scientific irrationalism. The language here is highly precise and specific to this text. This is because, again, a lot of it has been paraphrased from journal papers written on this topic, which are scholarly essays that have analyzed the text in depth. You should do this because it will offer you the most insightful points, the most specific language to use in the exam. The only danger is if you go too deep and you fail to supplement your points with enough evidence. So you must make sure that your points are backed up with sufficient quotations. Quacksalver, for example, is referring to someone who claims to have some skills, especially in potions and ointments. Dramatic irony satirizes scientific irrationality. Paragon, so that's someone who is regarded as a perfect example of something. Extremely helpful word, hubris. This is referring to exaggerated pride. It's often used in literature. Poetic justice, which is when someone, experiences a retribution for their action. Now this paragraph ends with a sentence to develop this idea of strangeness to answer the purpose. This is a very important aspect on why. So why do they use strangeness? You may write to entertain, to earn some money, but in the exam, the author always wants to send a message to you. Read this against the rubric and ask yourself the questions. So how much knowledge and understanding of the works did the candidate show? There is plenty of analysis, with a very specific analysis, in fact, on scientific irrationalism. The devices have been explored in great depth. Foil characters, right? Different literary device, a comparison with Jane Eyre in the middle. If you look at the concluding sentence, as we explore both novelists' treatment of strangeness in their zeitgeist, we realize that the nature of strangeness is significant because it explores certain issues. And that is the idea they treat their characters as constructs. Something happens to them. If it's a bad ending, then this is something that the author wants to criticize. Does not always apply, but it's a very good mental model in paper 2. Fifth body paragraph, which is A3, because we're writing 6 body paragraphs in total. Finally, the denouement of both novels illustrate the consequences of the protagonist's strangeness. We're taking something from the end because we want to illustrate a message. Denouement refers to the final part of the narrative, in which the plot is drawn together and everything is explained and resolved. Jane Eyre uses an authorial intrusion to apostrophize the reader. Reader, I married him. This is a classic quote that a lot of students use. Employing the active voice. Even though the same quote is chosen as any other student, the analysis is in fact very good because the literary device is being name dropped. The language is analyzed very thoroughly. There's an active voice here. Yet in the conservative Victorian epoch, questions arise as to whether this strange marriage is conventional. This is immediately followed by this Gothic conflagration at Thornsfield, analysis of this allusion, and therefore during your revision, instead of analyzing this quotation standalone, you should pair it up with the subsequently useful quotations. This whole part comes as a package that can be recycled and reused in other essays. The author is breaking the fourth wall, so they're directly addressing the reader, which is the meaning of apostrophizes here. The student has specifically picked allusion because a lot can be said about it. It's easy to remember this allusion in particular, and it adds more points for a literary device. Then in the interpretation, we talk about the voice of reason. There's this information outside of the text, which is that it was published with a male pseudonym. Then the different interpretations for contemporary versus modern readers. To modern readers, these marriages will not be regarded as strange. So maybe the strangeness depends on whether it actually contradicts what people think at the time. As a consequence, this strange yet successful marriage between these two characters ultimately appeals to their sense of goodwill. So that brings out again to the purpose. And that's the reason we have laid out from the beginning, which is A1 on her passion, and then going up her foil character as we learn that she's marrying Rochester, and in the end she successfully married this character. So there's a very logical sequence that goes from A1, A2, and A3, even though it is intertwined with B1, B2, and B3. Last body paragraph, B3. Whilst Jane Eyre's strangeness allows her to win the heart of Mr. Rochester, Granwy, our main character, compels the reader to reflect on human nature. This sentence draws a comparison between the two texts. Sometimes the comparison can be a little bit far-fetched, but that's okay. It's not necessarily the case that the examiner has read your books. It is just important that you show them that you did try to compare somehow, but the language, the impression of your writing, the analysis, that is far more important. Following the concoction of this ultimate perfume, again, the language is very specific. The character develops into a godlike messiah figure. So at the apotheosis of the story, which refers to the highest point of development, so the combination climax, this character development, more strangely, is due to a perfume that whips the crowd into a depraved fancy. This is highly appropriate literary language to paraphrase the text. It is just so poetic in itself, again paraphrased likely from journals. There's this quasi-biblical discourse, which indicates a style of writing that is quite similar to biblical language without strictly being biblical. The student comments on this switch in the narrative tone, and that is significant literary style and technique used by Susskind. After commenting on the device, he immediately takes a step forward and then illustrates the purpose of such, which is by invoking the themes of religious faith during the French Enlightenment. Susskind presents an existential perspective that critiques human nature. The strangeness of this, again, flow quote embedded into it, is a microcosm of human nature. So Susskind wrestles with the discussion of existentialism, the meaning of life. Here, the aesthetic imagination has infected the Enlightenment reason of the crowd, and that leads them to submit to the murderer. That is to say, this imagination, the perfume, has infected the reason and brainwashed them into submission. As a result, by depicting a strange denouement, Susskind questions human nature and implores the reader to reflect on our faith. Very well packed. The language, the appropriateness of the scene that has been chosen, which is the ending of this novel, the mentioning of the relevant literary devices, everything packed in together to forge a very strong message. A weakness of this essay so far is that there has not been a lot of intertextual comparison in favor of the development within the own text, but the conclusion does remedy this weakness and elevate it. Through the symbolism for characters and denouement, stating the device in the order they are presented, both authors wield strangeness as a potent lens to critique their societies. One-line description for Bronte's Jane Eyre, which harnesses the Red Room, so basically to run through the devices to summarize the line of argument. Conversely, Susskind's perfume, so there's appropriate linking words here, using similar devices, then it talks about and creates these effects on society. Some comparison here. While Bronte humanizes Jane's strangeness, Susskind dehumanizes Granwy, so there's contrasting use of verb here. It's very poetic language, the way that it's being organized, so that's the strength of using an alternating structure. They challenge their respective norms by presenting strangeness as a catalyst for societal change. Now we're on to more of a sociological perspective. Why did we need strangeness? This comparative lens reviews strangeness not as a fixed state, but the idea of a fluid construct. Fluid is a very useful vocabulary, especially in the 21st century when discussing various ideas, shaped by context that questions the boundaries of identity and morality. Again, our summary sentence, by juxtaposing these two characters where we've looked at, they ask the readers to confront the paradox of strangeness, and ultimately this work invites contemporary audience to reflect on how strangeness shapes our understanding of self and society. The idea that's been described in this essay, in this conclusion, is that cultural relativism. So it suggests that beliefs, values, and practices are understood within their specific cultural context. So what is considered strange or normal can vary significantly across different societies and historical periods. So another quite similar concept would be social constructivism, which emphasizes that meanings and understandings are constructed through social processes, and this can change over time. The impression you get from reading this conclusion is that it's written by someone who is quite well read into beyond literature and thought quite deeply about the work and its relation to society. So these are the kind of concepts that might really impress the reader and really develops the prompt. It understands the significance of strangeness. So I showed you the finished product, but how do you create the building blocks? These building blocks, they need to be versatile for multi-purpose analysis. So examples of macro devices for novels would be setting, symbolism, metaphor, allusion. So I've given a list here, but it's not exhaustive. The idea is you might have to use multiple ones, even within the same body paragraph. But during the time of the preparation, you would have put these devices together into very nice packages, so you remember them together. Note that there will be a whole different set of literary devices for other text types, like poetry. And most likely, you would have to read your own text, find very good analysis written on it. Can be papers, can be online websites, and then keep thinking about the text, and then try to apply these different devices to look into where they fit. This is the 3 steps for success. I would imagine that for a lot of students at the stage of high school, they would not have had the opportunity to have analyzed a lot of text, especially in language and literature. And therefore, you cannot really build meaningful experiences from reading so few texts and attempting to analyze them. You will need to overcome this by consulting a friend. You need to do this first step, which is to get a very thorough analysis of the text, have very robust discussion, and see what works. You'll be surprised at what points which you thought were bulletproof turned out to be completely flawed. You would have to extract some gems from some of your best classmates, of the best level 7 writings, and then abandon some points even within those very good essays. You have to scramble the material and then figure out a very logical and strong line of argument. Ideally, you should have read the book, but I know some students just watch the movie. Read a lot of analysis. Most importantly, it's not just the online analysis on the website, random YouTube videos, but you should read from journals and review articles, collecting the quotations and analysis, and then you discuss with your friends. You churn out at least 3 sample essays, and the topics can be quite easy to choose from, and I will show you later on. It can be on social commentary, but the other 2 might depend on the nature of your text. I shall show you how to morph the practice essay onto the exam question. So these are the assessment questions. Let's say we're taking number 2, some literary text, although set in a particular place or time, convey ideas that are universal. Remember the question, ideas that are universal. Universal is the keyword here. Revisiting A1, the strange persona of Jane Eyre can be interpreted now as a universal struggle for identity. This so-called tendency to deceit, now when I reinterpret it in the exam, would reflect her struggle to assert her identity. So this room mirrors her isolation when her passion is being suppressed, which resonates beyond Victorian norms and speaks to anyone stifled by conformity. And therefore, Bronte critiques universalizes Jane's fight for authenticity. This is how you would change up the analysis, but keep more or less the same quotation, change the way that you package the topic and concluding sentence to bend it to the question. For B1, how should we do it? This time, Granwy's tick-like nature symbolizes universal feelings of alienation. Again, we repurpose the same quotation, this newborn thing, which we previously talked about being strange, right, reflecting the biological urge for survival and denial of love. This time, the dehumanizing imagery transcends this period and evokes the feeling or the isolation of outsiders. Draw some kind of comparison with a previous text. So unlike Jane's emotional fight, Granwy's is existential. Susskind explores his universal idea of outsiderhood, which challenges the readers to confront differences Whereas Jane seeks relational identity, Granville's alienation highlights a broader, more universal human condition. So this is how some of the language has been repackaged for your reference, but when you rewrite it, you switch up the language for the topic and concluding sentences as well as analysis, again keeping the same quotations. Another example for A2, this time, the strangeness. We analyze it in light of the question. Now we're talking about universal value, let me remind you. Blanche, her oriental fashion versus Jane's plainness with Rochester. And this idea is on the universal idea of defying class norms. Some is British princess, such was doubtless the character that she intended to represent. Now this time, using the same device, the foil character underscores merit over status, which is timeless conflict beyond Victorian society. Timeless is just now the synonym for universal. Here, the Gothic imagery of the chestnut tree previously is on the failure of the strange marriage. This time, it foreshadows the universal romantic struggles. Bronte therefore advocates for intrinsic worth relevant across cultures, and her struggle reflects societal bias and romantic struggles, again, universal through time, and transcends this Victorian period. So this is how you would change it up. But in the exam, it is likely that you might pick slightly different quotations based on the 3 exemplar essays that you have written. Here, I've taken a more absurd example in which I take this completely 2 different essay prompts and just bend them with language. You sell them to the examiner. Actually, it's the same thing, but it's just in different coating. B2, again, you analyze in light of question. Tayar's faint, strange death, rattles scene, exploitation of Granville's genius. This time, the irony critiques hubris, which is a timeless flaw. Unlike Jane's conflict, social conflict, Tayar's scientific overreach speaks to universal vices. Borrow the same example of poetic justice. Susskind thereby satirizes scientific irrationality relevant beyond the Enlightenment period. Even the language satirizes dramatic irony, foil character, paragon of calculated reason, can all be used again. It's just that some of the language that you use to introduce the quotation is different, and then you embed a different idea at the end of your B2. Instead of talking about the strangeness of their time, you talk about these universal values and how the writer continues to explore them with the ending of both characters. That speaks something beyond their time. And then we proceed to A3. This time around, Jane's marriage universalizes the quest for mutual respect. This is similar to A2. This, again, the idea is developed by A2. Rochester's reliance on Jane shows balanced love, and then you use the same religious allusion. Unlike Granville's destructive end, Jane's resolution offers hope for a universal harmony. And for B3, Granville's apotheosis reveals universal susceptibility to manipulation. The same device and quotation, but repackaged. In the conclusion, now this is the opportunity to pack things, in a nice packaging. Okay, so you wrap your argument. We use symbolism, foils, and denouement to convey universal themes of identity, conflict, and morality. Think about some samples or some patterns in your writing. So previously, for A1 and B1, we just happened to have talked about personal identity struggles, the red room and the tick for the universal feeling of outside the hood. For A2 and B2, we happen to talk about societal conflicts, for class struggle and Tayar's ends, to symbolize something about Susskind's critique of enlightenment. For A3 and B3, we talked about poetic justice device, and that ties to resolution and warnings. And therefore, you can think of the line of argument as going from personal identity struggles to societal conflicts to resolution and warnings. So this would be the line of argument that just so happened emerged from our analysis, and then end with a beautiful sentence. So now you can see how this works. You can see that these are the 3 steps of success. The most consuming part is this, the first 2 parts, which is getting the book, reading the book, and then churning out these 3 sample essays. It would be far more efficient if you worked on this with external help. Please consider working with your friends on this together. The most difficult part is getting these good building blocks, which are the well-written analysis, which you cannot just copy from the internet. You have to refine and ensure that the phrasing is as good as you can get. And then you put your quotations together to convey an idea. This is how you become more versatile in your writing. I must warn you of the Sturgeon's law. 90% of everything is crap. Analysis online may not be the best ones. There can be multiple quotations that serve a similar purpose, but you should pick the one that is easier to contextualize during the exam, easier to analyze and extract more literary meaning. The other option for you is to find these exemplar essays elsewhere. So if you found this video helpful, you may consider purchasing our service. We will write 3 essays which have entirely different directions, so it will not be one essay and 2 other adapted ones. We need you to declare that you will treat the essay as exemplars and will not directly copy the essay and submit it as your homework. This is for your learning purposes. And the pros of ordering this service from us rather than elsewhere online is that we are very adept at writing specifically for the exam. This is quality assurance. However, the cons of this service is that it is not cheap. In the locality of Hong Kong, this price is equivalent to 1.5 to 2 hours of tutoring. The price is variable, but is listed in the description. It is variable because it is subjected to the availability of our very few tutors. When we have more tutors, the price will be cheaper. We will need to read 2 books, analyze, and research on the books before working on a comparative essay. So this is a very menial task and thoughtful exercise. So we are sorry that we cannot offer this service cheaply. But since we charge for this, we will make sure that it is worth the dollar and will contribute to your paper 2 meaningfully. If you decide to support us, this means a lot to the tutors among us who are extricating from financial plights. Here are a few more advice I have for you. Should you go for weekly tutoring sessions for IB English? The pros is you can catch the mistakes in your writing, in general improve your English, improve your writing style, and gain some consistency in writing practices. But the problem is incremental gains. What do I mean by that? Sometimes the student picks a quotation that is not particularly meaningful, a quotation that only allows adequate but not deep and insightful analysis. Instead, you want to fill your essay with as much level 7 material as possible. I could have tried to up-level the analysis and try to work around the material that the student has provided, but because of the limitations of the material, there's a ceiling to that. Instead, the approach is to have scraped the essay in its entirety, make the student rewrite it, and then teach them how to pick a better quotation and develop a better idea in the first place. So it requires the essay to be completely scraped away for the birth of a better one. Weekly lessons can offer that, but stretching things over a period of time to encourage the student to write from scratch drains time. It is not the most productive. Instead, I would highly recommend that you learn from the best samples. You should build on top of that and stand on the shoulders of giants. I would much rather the student internalize the samples I'd written for them and then adapt them for different purposes. You may argue that this may have deprived them of some learning opportunity when they could have researched deeper into the text and constructed their own arguments, but it is far more productive that they received my curated samples and then build on top of that. Secondly, you must learn from the most critical readers to perfect your exemplars as much as possible. One challenge that strong essays fall short of excellence is that they fail to foster a compelling argument. So that is understandable, as crafting perceptive arguments about concepts like strangeness can be difficult. Overcoming this hurdle is essential for developing literary interpretations of prompts and enhancing cognitive flexibility, especially when you're adapting practice essays to unfamiliar exam questions. So to improve, examine past papers for both language and literature across SL and HL. You will notice that while the question styles can vary, they often cluster around similar themes. So for example, the strangeness, the struggle to be understood, and how characters overcome limitation, they fall under identity and perception. Practicing an essay for one of these prompts will make it easy to adapt to another within the same category. For societal critique and power, questions include how writers portray societies, challenge preconceived ideas, how they represent wealth, power, and heroism. Morality encompasses questions about good and bad, happiness, universal ideas. Some questions will focus on specific literary device. I've used red to highlight danger, so it is a good idea to avoid these unless the devices are very prominent in your chosen text and you have a wealth of quotations to support it. Most of the time, some text combinations will not suit particular prompts, and that really depends on the characteristics of your text. When reading exemplar essays, you also see a lot of recurring ideas. And there's a saying, people think they hold political viewpoints, but viewpoints often hold them. Similar ideas have been explored throughout history, refined by great minds over the centuries. Your beliefs are shaped by what you have read, meaning that some ideas in exemplar essays likely stemmed from historical thinkers. Understanding key concepts, therefore, will help you to treat prompts meaningfully. Here I've listed 15 concepts to illustrate this, particularly for the question, let's say, about strangeness. It can inspire new modes of thinking. For cultural relativism, for example, strangeness isn't inherent, but is a product of cultural norm. Actions or identities considered strange are the ones that negate an era's dominant values. So in your hook, you can redefine strangeness as a marker of cultural dissonance, and that highlights the fluidity of societal standards. Now that's a very mature and very competent idea. For social constructionism, that ties to the struggle to be understood, reflecting socially constructed categories like gender or class. So these frame identities as deviant and causes misunderstanding when individuals challenge norms. For existentialism, this views strangeness, let's say, as a quest for authenticity. Characters' alienation comes from rejecting inauthentic societal roles. So that makes their otherness a proof of self-definition and a courage to find meaning in a so-called absurd world. For performativity, that can see overcoming limitations as performative acts that defy societal expectations, with characters redefining identity with repeated rebellion. Narratology is just a fancy word for points of view shaping reader perception by creating subjective realities. And that's so interesting because the central conflict in the text can therefore be seen as how point of view fragments reality. To what extent a piece of writing is truly objective. Feminist theory, commonly encountered in IB, frames the struggle to be understood, especially for female protagonists, as a gendered fight against patriarchal silencing. Keywords include stereotypes, feminism, and empowerment. For post-structuralism, that interprets strangeness as a result of unstable meanings, because language and norms fail to capture individual identities. Strangeness therefore becomes a linguistic or cultural slippage, and that grapples with the limits of fixed meanings. Phenomenology prioritizes personal perspectives and lived experience over objective observations. Subjective consciousness can clash with external perceptions when protagonists are seeking recognition of their realities. So this concept might take a little time to grasp. With these perspectives, you can stretch your imagination and engage with prompts in new ways. This helps you to develop a meaningful line of argument that creates truly the most outstanding essays. The ones that, after reading, you will think that the student is very perceptive and mature, and where the examiner can in fact learn something from reading your writing. If you're looking to enhance your original essay and you're not fighting a very tight deadline, I invite you to explore my exemplary essay walkthrough tutorial. You will find all the details in the description, which I'm continually updating with new exemplary essays. For now, it is 1.5 hour tutorial, but it's likely to have been lengthened by the time you read this. We will examine the exam-style questions, different ways of thinking about the prompt, and then analyze exemplary essays. The sample essays and pair of texts for now include Jane Eyre and Perfume, and these. By the time you read it, it's likely that it would have been there will be many more. See the description as the video will be lengthened over time with more exemplary essays. So the tutorial will offer a comprehensive analysis of strong and outstanding essays. It will focus on the writing styles, the use of literary devices. I genuinely hope that you will find this helpful. Thank you very much. If you purchased our service, we would ask you to declare that you received the exemplar essay for the purpose of learning and reference only, but not for submission. But now, I would like you to declare this even if you do not purchase the service, which is that you commit to putting forth your best effort in preparing for your IB English Paper 1 and Paper 2. Even if you decide not to purchase the service, I hope that the tips in this video have been very helpful. You must aim at coming up with the best exemplar essays, regardless of the service. Remember, IB English is all about writing for the exam. You can be a cultured Caucasian and with perfect command of English, but it does not mean that you will get a 7. The key is to overflow your essay with level 7 analysis that you have prepared beforehand, so that if you're going to hire a tutor somewhere, instead of a cultured Caucasian, please go for an astute Asian. This is a joke, but the idea is to go for tutors who are extremely exam-oriented. A lot of people can tell you what a good essay needs to do, such as one that is relevant to the prompt, it talks about some important themes and message of the author, it has good intertextuality, perfect grammar. How do you actually do that? You need to aim at getting these exemplar essays for your text specifically, instead of someone who imparts tips or vague advice for you and then drags you on and on for many lessons without much progression. The danger of someone who provides very vague advice is that it becomes very difficult when you try to replicate the effort, and you only have very little time during IB. Lastly, if I have seen further than others, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. If you are interested in the service, please contact us on Paper 2 Matters at the email in the description. Details of the service is in the description below and is available as long as this video is up. After receiving the exemplar essays, you can do the remaining job of practicing adapting your essays for different prompts under time conditions. You will be surprised that after just 3 to 4 essay practices, you would already be able to write very fluently for unfamiliar prompts during the exam. Hopefully this would spare your time for revision for other subjects and help you secure a 7 for IB English. If you have watched it to the very end, thank you very much. I hope this video alongside the well-received IB Paper 1 tutorials have been very informative. At least I haven't bored you with the many customer reviews and testimonials that found my tutoring and Paper 1 tutorials very helpful. But I will not include that because even I wouldn't believe in such reviews if someone showed them to me. But I hope all the best to your IB learning journey, and I hope you get a 7. Thank you very much.